One of the most common leadership mistakes I see isn't actually a leadership mistake. It's a systems mistake. And because of that, most organizations don't recognize it until much later. At first, it looks like commitment. Someone stays late, someone bridges a communication gap, someone takes on one more responsibility. Someone maybe even smooths over a bit of friction so the project can keep moving. Nothing feels particularly alarming. In fact, most of the time, these people get praised. They're adaptable, reliable, and easy to work with. But eventually, something interesting starts happening. The organization begins depending on the adaptation instead of addressing the reason adaptation became necessary in the first place. And that's the moment accommodation stops being support and starts becoming infrastructure. Hi, my name is Hawa Kambian, and I'm a leadership clarity advisor. At Executive Intuition, we explore how clarity becomes leadership's time-saving currency, because organizations rarely become overwhelmed all at once. More often, they become overwhelmed gradually, one accommodation at a time. A role isn't fully defined, someone compensates. Ownership is unclear, someone compensates. A process isn't working, so someone compensates. And because the work continues getting done, everyone assumes the system is functioning. But that's where clarity starts leaking, because what leaders often interpret as resilience is sometimes repeated compensation. And what organizations often interpret as commitment is sometimes a signal that the structure hasn't caught up with the reality it's asking people to navigate. So this is something I learned firsthand. I spent nearly 2 years inside a mission-driven organization, moving through multiple functions, right? Different responsibilities, different reporting structures, different expectations, and every shift made sense individually, right? The organization had real needs. I had relevant skills, so I adapted. Then I adapted again. And then again. Professionally, the story sounded great, right? We trust you. We think you'd be a great fit here. This is a growth opportunity. And to be fair, some of it genuinely was. But eventually, I noticed something. The role kept changing because the system kept changing. And every time it changed, I became part of the solution. Someone leaves, I adapt. Priorities shift, I adapt. New stakeholder requirements, I adapt. More complexity, I adapt. And after a while, I stopped asking, is this structure evolving? And started asking, how do I keep making this work? And that's a very different question, because one is about organizational design, and the other is about personal endurance. And organizations can accidentally build entire cultures around endurance. So this is where I usually slow down a bit, because when I look at patterns like this, I also sometimes use reflective tools, not to explain anything mystical, but just to notice what's already showing up underneath the behavior. So one of the cards that came up here was Nana Buluku. And what I find interesting about it is it's really about timing, not new beginnings in a dramatic sense, more like the moment where you realize something in you has already shifted but your environment is still responding to the old version of you. And that gap is where things get uncomfortable because you're no longer who you were in the previous season, but you're still being used in the same way. There's another layer here with what I call the Wheel of Fortune. And I don't really read that as things are going wrong. It's more like things keep changing, but the system doesn't actually change how it responds to change. So everything becomes adaptation. And at some point, the question stops being, can I keep up? And becomes, why is everything requiring me to adjust instead of the structure adjusting with it too? And I think that's the quieter leadership moment here. So this is where a certain leadership identity starts to show up, what I sometimes call our vision advocate pattern. And most people who carry this don't experience themselves as self-sacrificing. They experience themselves as useful, right? So it sounds like, I'll handle it. I'll translate this for them. It's easier if I step in. I can absorb this for now. And honestly, those are often very competent people. The issue isn't the skill. It's what the skill quietly becomes responsible for. Because over time, the organization stops building the muscles that you are constantly using. So instead of clarity being distributed, you become the clarity. Instead of accountability being shared, you become the stabilizer. And instead of systems being designed, you become the system that holds it together informally. And that's where something I call capacity debt starts to form. Not in a dramatic way, but more like things only work because someone is consistently overextending in the background. So it doesn't feel broken. It just feels held until that person isn't holding it anymore. And then everyone notices what was never actually built. So if we bring it back to something practical, I often sit with a few questions here. Not as reflection exercises, but as pattern recognition. Where am I repeatedly compensating for something the system hasn't resolved? If I stopped absorbing this tomorrow, what would actually become visible? And maybe a more honest question, is my contribution making the system more capable or just more comfortable staying the same? And there's always a small observation I like to come back to. You can usually tell what a system depends on by noticing what people automatically bring to you. Not what you're assigned, but what arrives on your desk without discussion. That often tells you more about structure than any org chart does. And the shift is actually quite simple. Support should strengthen systems, not quietly replace them. So if this feels familiar, I go deeper in our Executive Intuition article on Substack, where I break down how accommodation slowly becomes culture inside organizations. You can find that link in the description below. And if you're navigating this in real time, I also explore these patterns more experientially on Insight Timer. So I'd love to have you join us there for a free live session. Ultimately, clarity isn't just about understanding what's happening. It's about changing what you keep agreeing to carry. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next one.